This lesson will cover 3 books, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. Ezra and Nehemiah, as you can see in the description, cover the return of some of the exiles to Jerusalem, and Esther commemorates her act of bravery to save her people from extinction. In this lesson, I've decided to put the Net Bible on the left and back to Constable's notes on the right because that's the commentary I have in this app, and so I'll just have to call him out whenever he lapses into sexism, which he will do on Esther for sure, although not as bad as you might expect, but still. Anyway, we'll start with Ezra here, and it begins with the decree of King Cyrus of Persia to allow exiled Israelites to return to Judea and rebuild Solomon's temple, as predicted by the prophet Jeremiah. So again, the books in order of the Standard English Bible are not chronological necessarily, and there's other timelines you can consult for who was writing what book when, or when the events were, because sometimes these books will refer to something that actually isn't covered yet in the order of books, but has happened in history. So that's the case with these. So the prophet Jeremiah predicted certain things, and they're coming to pass now. And if you're familiar with the book of Daniel, you know that the Babylonian Empire, ruled by Nebuchadnezzar, was taken over by the Medes and Persians. So the 70-year exile is ending at this point in the text. And I'm pretty sure that if had many of today's Christians been alive during this first exile, they would have interpreted prophecies of return as purely spiritual, to set a precedent or make a point that just because of where you are in history seems like everything from now on must be spiritual doesn't mean it is. And then if you put yourself in the Old Testament times and look at what they didn't know that we can see in hindsight, you would probably make the same mistake of thinking, well, this is the end, we're done, we're never coming back. And that didn't turn out, but it's very physical and literal, and that's because that's what God promised. As I've mentioned before, all the promises and the covenants are almost exclusively for this life. Anyway, let's go down to chapter 2, and it's fairly long. You can see this kind of it matches up to certain points in the text, so you'll see some things fly by there at different times, but we'll go down to chapter 2, verse 61, and this has been a list of those people returning. And notice that in verse 62, there were some priests who would not be permitted to serve as such until their lineage could be determined. So, although the promise to Abraham still stood, and anyone could be a convert to Judaism, the priesthood required genetic descent from Levi. So there's that physical component again. Now we'll go down to, you can see here, chapter 3, the altar is rebuilt and rebuilding the temple. And then chapter 4, we see that there was opposition to this rebuilding project from people of Samaria who were partly related to the Israelites. And they begin by saying they want to help, but the help is refused. So they keep doing whatever they can to hinder the reconstruction, including sending letters to Babylon warning of possible rebellion and loss of tax revenue. So Babylon, as I've mentioned before, has left some people there, the poorest people usually, to maintain the land. And there's some people here who don't like that they weren't allowed to help. So they're trying to cause trouble politically back in Babylon because, just out of they didn't like what was happening. So they're trying that at first. And then we go down to verse 19. And we see there that this appears to have reached the king after the temple was finished, so the work they want to stop by that point is on the city walls. And the king grants their request. So our lesson in this so far is that even when God answers our prayers with a yes, such as, in this case, the return to rebuild Jerusalem and the wall and the temple, even if God answers our prayers with a yes, it doesn't mean we won't face any obstacles, because testing is part of the purpose of this life. So they're being tested. Things don't go smoothly, even though we know this is God's will, because that's just one of the purposes of life. So just a little lesson for us there. And then we'll go down to chapter 6. There's some more of the political back and forth here in chapter 5. Whoops, I skipped chapter 6 somehow. There it is. the text of the letter that they had sent to the king, and it was in chapter 5, and then chapter 6 tells us that King Darius the Persian, not King Darius the Mede, this is a different Darius, searched out the original order to rebuild the temple, and it clearly permitted the temple's reconstruction and death by impaling for anyone who would try to change the order. So, according to the commentary, it was finished in early 515 BC, which fulfilled the prophecy of 70 years from when Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed it to the time they would start coming back to rebuild. And this is the temple that would stand until 70 AD. This is the temple that Jesus would come to and so forth. So this is the one they're starting to rebuild. And chapter 7 is when the scribe Ezra leaves Babylon for Jerusalem. So Ezra was a scribe, and he was in the exile, and he's coming back to Jerusalem to teach the law to the Israelites there. And then chapter 8 lists the others who went with him. And chapter 9 is Ezra's prayer of repentance and confession for the whole nation. So he's speaking for them collectively. And then chapter 10, the people repent and confess with him. So that's basically what these chapters are about. But let's go down to verse 14 in chapter 10. And notice, starting in verse 14, that anyone who had married foreign wives had to send them away. Nothing is said about provisions for the divorced wives or anything, but remember that Levite from an earlier lesson who threw his concubine to that violent mob of rapists. Marriages were less about love than property in those days, and some people were more obviously cold-hearted than others, but we have to be careful not to port our sensitivities back into this culture and time. So apparently I would assume, but I can only assume, that they made provision for these wives, but they were doing this because it's required by the law that they shouldn't have married those wives in the first place. And these are Levites. So that's what we're, just to point out what was in verse 14 there. So the book of Ezra is mostly the account of prophetic fulfillment, the proof of God's authorship of the scripture and control of historical events. So the thing is that this, as I think I've said before in other lessons, that prophecy is the fingerprint of God on the Bible. So we can't ignore it, and this is a fulfillment, and a past fulfillment. And sometimes in study of prophecy, it's not always easy to know whether something has happened in the past or whether it has happened completely in the past. So by at least being familiar with these things, we know there was some fulfillment already, and we have to be careful about how many times the cycle can come around to that same prophecy. So now we're going to move on to Nehemiah, and the first chapters of Nehemiah are really I think the first 7 chapters are his own personal account of events. So he's writing in the first person, whereas Ezra focused more on the temple and spiritual purification, Nehemiah focuses more on repairing the wall around Jerusalem. And at the end of chapter 1, he states that he was the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes when he heard about the condition of the wall. So that was his job. That's what he was doing there. And then in chapter 2, the king notices that he appears to be depressed and asks him why. And when he tells him, the king grants him permission to go to Jerusalem and oversee the repair of the wall himself. And then chapter 3 lists the names of the builders, and it serves as a good source of data for anyone interested in the details that identify the area. This is important because of a recent movement to claim parts of southern Africa as the real location of Jerusalem, based only on the most superficial similarities of terrain. It takes more than a few hills and rivers to identify a location, and this is one of those dry, boring passages that gives you valuable data if you want to look into those things, at least to know that it exists and where it might be. So here it is in this, little red book that has information. Like I said, if you're inclined to look up those details, there they are. But the point is that these superficial arguments for a different location for the events of the Bible are not going to cut it if you call them out by presenting this information. So you get some of these things, different passages of, little details that tell you that there's a whole bunch of things identifying the topography, and you have to match all of it. You can't just match a few rivers and hills. And then we'll go down to chapter 4, which records the continued opposition to the restoration from the locals there. But this time they're not content with sending letters of complaint to Babylon, so they assemble an army to move against Jerusalem. So Nehemiah's advice is to have workers take turns standing guard, and they were all to carry their swords and other weapons with them as they worked. And he would also remind everyone that the God they serve will bless them if they're persistent and faithful. So he's just, dealing with the motivation and addressing their fear of being attacked and still taking practical steps. And then chapter 5, it reports that the people had become impoverished during this time, having to go without food or go into debt. They were really having a hard time, and sometimes even having to sell their children into slavery just to keep from starving. But Nehemiah discovers that the real cause of the poverty was the greed of the wealthy among them, who were ignoring the laws of Moses concerning not charging interest to the poor and making loans instead of gifts. So they were taking advantage of these suffering people coming back from exile. So they got a good tongue lashing for that. And we can see down here in verse 9, he makes them return everything they had taken and stop the confiscation of property that they were taking as collateral for their loans. And so he put a stop to all that. I don't know why he had to tell him, but he did. And then chapter 6, meanwhile, the enemies of the Israelites made up false charges of intent to rebel and choose a king of their own, but Nehemiah calls their bluff and just keeps going. So they were just trying to scare him, and he knew it. They really weren't, there was no evidence to back this up. And the people around there knew him as a man of integrity and didn't listen to the gossip. So that attempt to stop the work failed as well. So, and this is a good lesson also, is a lot of times we're quick to throw somebody under the bus because we've heard a bad report from somebody we like about somebody else we've been friends with, but you have to remember what kind of people they are and go by their history and know what kind of integrity they have and character, and not be so quick to turn on them. And everybody tends to do that. We just, we hear something bad about somebody and we want to be in the accepted good group, so we turn on them. And it's just a human problem, and we need to be aware of that. So anyway, down in verse 15, we see there has been another attempt to lure him into a trap, and the wall is finally finished anyway, and the enemies realize that it's only done with the help of Israel's God by this point, because they've tried to stop it. And then chapter 7, after appointing permanent guards and officials, the text lists the results of a genealogical search for the residents. So they had to establish who was in what family line so they could assign land to them. And then down in chapter 8, and there you can see all the details there as I scroll. Then we have chapter 8, when everything was done, the people were permanently settled. They gathered to hear the law read, just as had been done before the exile at one point. And notice, though, in verse 8, let's go down to that, that many needed the words translated as they were read aloud. Since in the exile in Babylon, they only knew Aramaic rather than Hebrew. So it was being read in Hebrew but translated into Aramaic, and this is a result of the Babylonian captivity. And so words are not an end in themselves. The fact that they were allowed to translate rather than having to teach them Hebrew is telling us something. Words are not an end to themselves. They are the means to an end, which is communication, understanding. And that's why even the translators of the King James Version stated in their preface to the reader that the Word of God must not be locked up in letters and syllables, which ironically many today have done by forbidding the use of any translation since then. But the translators of the King James themselves would not approve of King James onlyism on that ground that this is somehow the strokes of a pen that must be preserved, and who cares about what the language is doing, because languages are always changing. But and we can see this example here of reading the law after the Babylonian captivity, that translation is perfectly fine. So It's the thought that counts. It really is. Thought for thought is actually the best translation, because if you could translate just word for word, all you would need is a dictionary, and it would not be understandable at all, but that would be purist to make that point. And then we'll go down to, if we look at this section again, the people have been eager to hear the words, which is often not the case with Christians today. And they wept at how far they had fallen from God's ideal. But Nehemiah tells them that this was to be a time of celebration, according to the law, that this time of year that they were doing this, because, in the quote there, the joy of the Lord is your strength, and that's a popular Christian chorus that you can see there in the end of verse 10. And the Feast of Tabernacles, described in this section, serves the purpose of having the people enact what they heard, to make them participate in the law rather than just hear it. For us, the lesson is to live and breathe what we believe, to make it the focus of our lives instead of an afterthought or the last resort, as we kind of people get lazy and comfortable, and it's not illegal to be a Christian, and so they just kind of shove it to the side of their life. So this purpose of this festival, and all the festivals really, is participation. So now we go down to chapter 9, and notice verse 2 here. Among the assembly of faithful Israelites were foreigners, and they, at this point, were separated from the Israelites of pure genetic descent for this one particular assembly, where the people confessed the sins of their ancestors. The foreigners didn't have those ancestors. So even though they were Israelites with the full rights of anybody else in Israel, there was still the genetic component that made a difference at times, just to make that point. And then chapter 10, and the people signed a written covenant to keep all those laws. So every time there's a renewal, the people have to also have some kind of witness going on. And after the listing of assigned living areas, and here we can see the names, and then down into, the more confessions, and then assignment of living areas in chapter 11. And then I think it's just the leaders that march around Jerusalem to dedicate the wall. So they walked all around the wall that had finally been finished. And then they list the priests and Levites who returned. And then we I skipped too many chapters again. Sometimes when I scroll past, I don't see the number. Chapter 13, it's on to some final house cleaning and a final plea from Nehemiah to God to remember all he had done for his honor. So he's like, just so you know, God, I did all this stuff for you. Wink, wink. So now we're going to move on to Esther. And I anticipate objecting to at least some point of the commentary on this book, just because it features a woman. You know what's going to happen. The Persian king Xerxes is throwing an extended party for his officials, and his wife, Queen Vashti, is throwing a separate one for the women. That's just how it was in the society. But when Xerxes and his guests got good and drunk after a few days, he orders Vashti to be brought to him to show her off to his guest. But she refuses, so the king gets irate. Though the text only mentions her refusal and not the reason, it is believed that it would have been shameful for her to appear there, since society kept women hidden from public view. That's why they were having separate parties. So for the most part, she would not appear even in the best of conditions, but especially not now in front of a room full of drunken men. It was just really, really improper for him to ask her to do that. And there's one part of the commentary that one person speculated that she may even have been pregnant at the time and had a bigger reason, pun intended, to not appear, on the basis of calculating when a certain son of hers was born that would eventually take power. But anyway, aside from the several guesses as to motive for her refusal, the point is that it was seen as a slippery slope to borrow a quote right from the commentary, a women's liberation movement. That's how the commentary puts it. Society seems to fear nothing as much as freedom and equality for women. Women's liberation is just like a trigger word these days. But liberation is not a dirty word, and modern Christianity should be ashamed to treat it as such. But the most important point lost on modern theologians is the fact that this is a heathen king in a heathen society, not a Christian marriage from which we should take any lessons or examples or rules. People who like to use this example as keeping women, wives especially, in little pink boxes and know their place, are misapplying it to Christian marriage. There is just nothing to connect the two. We don't get our cues about how to behave from the heathen. So Vashti is basically handed divorce papers, and she has, just because she disrespected a drunken king for demanding that his wife expose herself to shame, so she's divorced, and this is just, too much for them to stand. Even though it was totally wrong for them to demand this, they just couldn't stand it that she defied him. So they need to send a clear message to stave off this slippery slope to all the other women, the uppity women who might get wild and dangerous ideas of their own from Vashti's examples, because she was queen. And yes, I am being sarcastic, because that's what that kind of an attitude deserves. These uppity women might just get wild and crazy, wild, uncontrolled thoughts. We can't have that. So we'll go down to chapter 2. So now the hunt is on for a replacement queen, and they have this beauty pageant. And once again, we see God working behind the scenes, because the plot to eradicate his people will not take him by surprise. He knows what's going on, and he's moving the chess pieces around. And it just so happens that one of the exiles of Israel was a man named Mordecai, who was the guardian of his cousin Esther, since she had become an orphan. So she was his cousin, but he was a lot older, and so he took her in when her parents died. Of course, the commentary can't resist making Esther a sinner for violating the laws of Moses in exile, in spite of the fact that as a woman she would be in much less of a position to disobey the heathen society in which she lived than a man would be, who in this case the commentary compares to Daniel, who stood up to the king. Daniel was a high official and a man. But a woman had far less choice even with an ordinary man, much less the emperor of the known world. It goes so far in the commentary to accuse her of fornication and marrying a foreigner, as well as eating unclean food. Like Rahab and Bathsheba, it implies that God would have preferred for all the Jews to die, in spite of the fact that it was her foster father, Mordecai, her cousin, who advised her in all this. The commentary at least adds at the end that she probably had no choice, but why not lead with that thought? Scripture never condemns Esther or sees a need to overlook any alleged sins, so why do the commentators feel such a need to bring them to the forefront? They start off saying, oh, she ate unclean food and she didn't put up a resistance like Daniel did and blah, blah, blah. And then they say, well, she probably didn't have a choice. Moving on, they brush these things over and plant seeds in your mind that somehow she was a worse sinner than a man would have been in the same position. So let's go down here to verse 10. And what exactly would the commentators have Esther do? She was between a rock and a hard place, defy the king or defy her foster father. She's going to defy somebody, because he told her to do something to defy the king. He told her to defy the king. So no matter what she does or doesn't do, somebody's going to call her a sinner, but not somebody in the Bible. That's the commentators and theologians. The Jews were in exile precisely because they had defied God, so why pick on Esther for noncompliance, especially while letting Mordecai off the hook, since he told her not to reveal her ethnicity? And how would she keep that hidden if she was practicing Judaism and adhering to the law? As the saying goes, this is why we can't have nice things. Now let's go down to verse 18. And in time, Mordecai learns of this plot to assassinate the king, so he tells Esther, who tells the king. But for now, this patriotic act is forgotten. It's recorded in writing, but they file it away, basically. So he gets nothing for saving the king's life, for now. Then chapter 3, eventually there's this man named Haman who is appointed to very high office, and he loved to have people bow down to him wherever he went. But Mordecai refused, and when people found out he was a Jew, they reported him to Haman, who decided that all Jews must die. That sentiment still persists to this day, because many blame the sins of a few on the whole race and or nation. So one Jew dissed him, and so they all have to die. That's this guy's mentality. So Haman, if we go down to verse 8, lies to the king that all Jews disobey the king's laws, and he recommends an irrevocable edict be issued to wipe them all out on a certain day. So the king grants Haman's request. He doesn't know what's going on. And then we'll go down to verse 12 here. And he sends out letters to all the provinces to wipe out the Jews everywhere. So they pick a certain day and they're supposed to all attack the Jews, including women and children. No sparing anything. You confiscate all of their loot, their possessions. And it's all because one Jew wouldn't bow to this egotistical tyrant Haman. So now down to chapter 4. Mordecai gets wind of this, so he and all the Jews in all the provinces start to wail, and this gets Esther's attention, and she wants to know what's going on. So down in verse 10, he tells her to petition the king about this, but she tells Mordecai that she could very well die just for approaching the king without being summoned. And then he replies down here, verse 13, that first of all, he points out that being queen won't get her out of this edict of genocide. So if for any reason, if just in case she had been thinking that she would survive and, she wouldn't do anything about it, but she would go on living, he's like, nah, they're going to kill you too. It doesn't matter if you're queen. So, and then he says, if she refuses to act, God will raise up someone else. Now, what does this do to the theologians and commentators' claims that women are God's last resort? How can she be the last resort in this case? Because she's the first, and Mordecai is saying someone else will be the last resort if you don't act. So she's the first one. Fortunately, Mordecai is not like the theologians. He tells her that she was likely put in this position so that she could act for just this purpose, for such a time as this. Not God's last resort, his first. So she sends word to Mordecai that if she's going to do this, all the Jews have to fast for 3 days and 3 nights, and she and her maids would do the same, and then she will take her life in her hands and approach the king. So she's like, okay, so be it. Here we go. And then down to chapter 5, she makes this plan, and it's to do much more than just simply walk up to the king and expose the plot. That's not how you do things, and she wasn't stupid. So even the commentary at this point has to admit that Esther not only has a clever plan, she also is taking initiative. This wasn't what Mordecai told her to do. He just said, do it. She figured out how. So she's taking the initiative to contact the king. And to most theologians, this is a great and terrible sin, as we've gone over before. But when the nobleness of the act cannot be denied, as it is in this case, such impertinence of taking initiative while female is conveniently overlooked. So she first simply asks for a private dinner with the two of them and Haman, and the king grants her wish. So all she's doing at this point is saying, let's have dinner with Haman. Okay, so then we go down to verse 9. Haman is thinking, because he's been invited to this private dinner, that he's really being honored. So he goes home that day and brags to his friends, but he still can't abide that Jew Mordecai. So they all tell him, his friends and family, to build a gallows and hang Mordecai on it after the private dinner. So Haman is planning to approach the king after the dinner and tell him to hang Mordecai on these gallows that he erected on his property. But, as we'll see down in here in chapter 6, God is still working behind the scenes, and that night the king can't sleep. This is God's doing. So he has historical records brought to him to be read. I mean, it sounds like an excellent sleep aid to me, reading historical documents. But it just so happens that the section read to him included Mordecai's earlier act of patriotism that saved the king's life. So the king is surprised that no honor was given to Mordecai for this. But before he can decide what to do, Haman shows up. And Haman, of course, is there with the intention of telling the king to hang Mordecai on his gallows. Really bad timing, but this is God's doing. And then down in verse 5, when he enters the room, the king speaks first and asks him how best to honor someone without saying who it was. So Haman advises this lavish honor, all the details you can read there, because he's thinking it's going to happen to him. He will be the one honored. I mean, who else would the king be wanting to honor? So he really lays it on thick that this person should get all these things. But to his utter horror, as we see in verse 10, the king tells him to do all that for Mordecai. What a plot twist, as far as Haman was concerned at least. So now, Off goes Haman, down verse 11, to make sure everyone knows what an awesome guy Mordecai is. So here's this guy he wanted to hang on a gallows, and he's having to lead him around and tell everybody how wonderful Mordecai was. And then he goes home to cry about it to his friends and family, of course. He's just been utterly humiliated. And when they hear what happened, they realize he's doomed. And just then, the king's servants arrive to take him to the private dinner. I'm guessing Haman suddenly has lost his appetite, but he has to go. So, chapter 7, after 2 days of this banquet, the king asks Esther what she wants. And she pleads for her own life and the lives of her people. Totally unexpected by everybody but her. The king is incensed that anyone would threaten his queen, and he demands to know who issued this edict, and she points and says, the enemy is this vile Haman, who at this point is likely turning ghostly white and wishing he were invisible. So, down in verse 6, the king leaves the room, goes out to his garden to try to figure out how to deal with this shock and ponder Haman's fate, while Haman, in the meantime, throws himself at Esther's mercy. But seeing him close to the queen when he re-enters the room, the king just blurts out, will he even try to molest the queen while I'm still here? So, upon hearing this, the attendants put a bag over his head, basically. They cover his face, which is likely where the movie V for Vendetta, I think it was, got the idea of you put this black bag over somebody and haul them off to prison. But that's what they do to him. He is a goner. And then one of the attendants told the king about the gallows that Haman had made for Mordecai, and the king says, hang him on it. And there's you look at the commentary, and whether it was actually a gallows for hanging or a place to impale people, as was the custom back then in Persia, doesn't matter really. Somebody's going to die on this thing. So the irony. I mean, and then chapter 8 here, for even more irony, Mordecai is put in charge of Haman's estate. But the problem still remains regarding the edict to kill Jews. So Esther begs the king to do something, and his solution, we can see down here in verse 8, is to give Esther and Mordecai the freedom to write whatever edict they want. So they send the message to all the provinces that the Jews are permitted to do whatever they want in self-defense. In other words, turn the tables, and whoever they defeat, they get to confiscate all their stuff. So finally the big day comes, and the fighting goes on. People still try to attack the Jews anyway, in spite of all this turn of events, and the Jews were preserved. They soundly defeated anybody who tried to attack them, and they got all their stuff. And during this time also, all Haman's, I think, 10 sons were also hung on his gallows. So total irony. And then down in verse 18, we can see here that this whole event, this whole series of things, became what's called the Feast of Purim. For the Jews, it serves a reminder of God's providence even in exile, which, and also remembering Esther's bravery. And for Christians, it should remind us that God takes any action against his people very seriously. There are a lot of Christians who are anti-Jews, anti-Israel, but on the off chance, as far as they're concerned, that somehow the people in Israel, can't be Jews, none of them, that they better be careful and think twice about attacking or hating or spreading discontent about them. They're no worse than any other nation in the world, to be honest. Nobody has a right to point fingers, and nobody has a right to say occupation, because every nation in the world is occupying some land that belonged to somebody else before. So it's just hatred of Jews, and Christians need to really take that seriously. And then down here finally to verse 29. Notice another fact in all this. Esther does this with full authority. Mordecai does really well after this. We can see in chapter 10, it goes on about his exploits, but if the theologians and commentators can go out of their way to lessen the achievements of women in the Bible, I can go out of my way to highlight them, and that's what I try to do in every case, because you can find decades, generations, multitudes of writings that always downplay and blame and lessen the achievements of women in the Bible. So yes, I will take every opportunity to undo that. And that's all we have for these 3 books of the Bible.